Hi, hello everyone. Thanks for joining us for this learning lunch. My name is Hui Pham. I'm the Preservation Program Director here at the Washington Trust for Historic Preservation. You're joining us for one of our educational workshops that we put on from here time to time. And this one in particular is called Workshop on Commercial Property, Assessed Clean Energy and Resilience, also known as PACER, for financing in Washington State. And we're joined today thanks to our education sponsors. So I'll leave that on the screen. Just some housekeeping. If you guys have any questions throughout the presentation, feel free to drop it in the chat or use the Q&A feature. We're leaving a little bit of time at the end to address those questions, but as you see, the PACER program is very dense. There's a lot to cover, and we're excited to have our speakers join us today. So let's introduce them. We have Richard Martinez and Banu Erdim with Kitsap Bank, as well as John MacLean with Energy Efficiency Finance Corporation. And without further ado, I will let them take over from there.
Hi, everyone. So my name is Banu. So before I start, Rich, John, and myself, we are all delighted to be here today to talk to you about PACER program in Washington. Thanks everyone for being here, and of course, thanks to the Washington Trust for Historic Preservation for this opportunity. And in this workshop today, we'll be covering these questions. What PACER is. We are going to start with an introduction. What the program is and how does it work, including providing national perspectives and a sense of the larger PACE industry. And John will deep dive into the PACER basics from the perspectives of commercial building owners, including main financing features and project development and financing steps. And then I will introduce 4 different types of PACER projects. And then Rich and myself will provide information about the PACER timeline in our state, such as legislative background, how it started, and where we are. Then we will talk about how you can help promote this program in your respective jurisdiction. So many of you might be familiar with this program already, or some of you can be relatively new to this program. So that's why I want to give my elevator pitch on what PACER is. So it stands for Commercial Property Assessed Clean Energy and Resiliency. So PACE is a financing structure in which building owners borrow money for energy efficiency, renewable energy, or other projects, and make repayments via an assessment on their property tax bill. And Washington's version of this program also permits financing for resiliency retrofits. So adding a R to PACE to emphasize that this type of financing can also cover resilience measures such as seismic retrofits, stormwater measures, and fire protection, in addition to clean energy and efficiency. So as we all know, preparing communities for success is both harder and more important than ever. Questions like, what is the future of work and school in a community rebuilding from pandemic? Or are you experiencing climate impacts? Are you creating jobs in climate solutions? Is your community's population growing, shifting? Why? Definitely, there is no single opportunity can answer all of these questions, but for economic developers, it's good to know of at least one more tool to build on, which is Washington's new PACER program. And here is the nationwide impact of PACE program. The program has been used successfully in many other states, active in 25 states and the District of Columbia, to finance energy efficiency and renewable energy retrofits on existing buildings, as well as projects in new buildings. And Washington proudly, as I mentioned earlier, proudly takes it further with resilience too. And since 2005, PACE has enabled financing for over 2,500 property owners, amounting to more than $2 billion of investment, and created almost 24,000 jobs. So from the graph on your right, you can see here the just exponential growth in CPACE financing across the country over the last decade. It got off to a slow start around 2009, but as more states have adopted CPACE enabling legislation, which is the first step, more counties have opted into these programs. And of course, the visibility and excitement around PACE has increased within those counties that have adopted the program. And 22 may be be an inflection point for owners, operators, and developers to ascertain the climate risk associated with their properties and respond or risk losing tenants, investors, and property value. So definitely from capital raising to buy-sell decisions, underwriting, financing, and resilience planning, climate change impacts every part of an asset's life cycle. And it is entering the mainstream investor dialogue more and more. So growing awareness of climate change and climate responsibility is one of a number of trends that indicate wider use of this CPACER financing this year and beyond. So who can use it? Eligibility property means any privately owned commercial, agricultural, industrial, or multifamily real property of 5 or more dwelling units. Eligible property may be owned by any type of business, corporation, individual, or nonprofit organization permitted by state law. It is not used for residential improvements in single family or smaller multifamily buildings. In some states, yes, there are residential PACE programs, but in Washington at this point, we just have an authority for commercial PACE, as our focus will be on today. So as I stated before, in order to have a CPACER get to work, first step is a county adopts an ordinance and guidelines that govern how the CPACER program works. And John will deep dive into this soon, but here is the quick overview how it works actually. So first, the property owner identifies what are the needed improvements for their property. For example, they could have a complete energy audit that identifies all the energy efficiency improvements that would be practical for the building under the pursuit. And of course, these plan improvements are reviewed by a qualified professional, for example, a certified energy auditor for energy improvements or a professional civil engineer for seismic improvements. And then a property owner identifies capital provider for their project, and they reach mutual terms of what the transaction would look like for financing, including interest rate and term. And then the owner submits application materials to the program administrator. This person can be from county office or third party. And then the program administrator reviews application, administers the checklist, and then the program administrator approves it or requests additional information. But upon approval, the capital provider closes financing, county records lien agreement, the improvements get underway, paperwork is filed, the project is underway, and eventually repayment is collected directly by the capital provider. So as you see here, most work is between the building owner and the capital provider. Role of county is limited. And actually, before handing it over to John for more details, so I would like to pause here and check if we have any questions so far. Then, John, I think your slide.
Great. Thank you, Banu. And thank you, and Chris, for organizing this. And thank you all for attending and your interest. We are really bullish on CPACER and the benefits it offers building owners to finance upgrades in their buildings, not only the efficiency and renewables, but also all of the resilience measures, including building envelope. And even I was just looking at the King County guidebook, which is quite instructive. The financing of improvements to a building to reduce lead in drinking water is also allowed. So the R in resilience covers a significant spectrum of building needs that you have with your buildings. The financing is structured as a property tax assessment with a county lien. that lien is superior to all other liens except for the obligation of the building and building owner to pay other county taxes. So the assessment runs with the building, it survives the building sale. The obligor is the building owner. And the way I like to think about it, my background is public finance, municipal finance. I like to think about it as a local improvement district of just one single building. I think that's a really useful way. And in your communities, you're probably familiar with local improvement districts where property owners in a given geographic area voluntarily undertake or vote to undertake assessments for public improvements. The legislature authorized the PACER financing of Washington State in 2020. Rich will fill you in on all the latest tweaks to the legislation that are occurring successfully in this session. And the reason, the public rationale, is that these investments generate public goods, reducing greenhouse gas emissions, economic development and jobs that Banu mentioned, as well as reduced emergency response risks. A key element of the state legislation is that it's enabling legislation. It gives the county an option. So every county has to adopt their own ordinances. And we'll give you a brief on which counties in Washington State have done that in a moment. Because of the lien and because of the nature of the assessment, the main benefits to the building owner are that the financing is more secure for the capital provider or lender, and that results in significantly longer tenors or terms, as well as lower rates. And when you lower the rate and extend the financing term, your payments are lower, obviously, and that can allow deeper and longer payback measures to be implemented. Let's go next, Banu. Thank you. Can you switch? Thank you, Banu. So the way this works and the way the legislation works in Washington State, it's designed to have the capital provider really have the bulk of the responsibilities. Capital providers providing the funding. There's no public funding involved. And also the billing and collections are done by the capital provider. The main roles of the county have to do with enforcing the lien, if should there be any default events, and even in those cases, the onus and the protagonist role is on the capital provider. A significant point, and this is really important to point out, if you're a building owner and you're considering PACER, is that you do need to confer with your lien holders, particularly your first mortgage lien holder, because the lien holder consents are required as a condition of undertaking PACER. A main benefit, and this is I'll pose this as a question to explore for you all, the building owners, is the extent to which property taxes are passed through to your tenants. In most commercial triple net leases, they can be passed through. Also in triple net leases, the tenants are paying energy costs, or at least a portion of their own area energy cost. So their savings that result from the efficiency measures can be offset by the assessment that's passed through. And an important element too of context here in Washington State is that in 2020, the legislature passed House Bill 1257, which creates building energy performance standards for all commercial buildings in Washington State greater than 50,000 square feet. The city of Seattle has had similar building performance energy standards for some time, starting with benchmarking, monitoring, and then phased in commitments to reduce the energy utilization index of a given building. And presently, and I believe this legislation has legs in the legislature, it passed crossover, there's new legislation that would lower that threshold to 20,000 square feet. There are incentives that are offered by the state. I'm also hoping, expecting that the funding for those incentives is going to get expanded as well by virtue of revenues accruing to the state from the Climate Commitment Act, the Cap and Invest program. But I just want to draw your attention to those energy performance standards that apply to commercial buildings. Next one, thank you. The development of a project really begins with understanding your building energy use and getting engaged with a contractor, an engineer to assess your building, determine what your level of efficiency is now, to set up a energy information management system and monitoring system, and then outline measures that can reduce the energy use or produce renewable energy for your building, and coming up with basic preliminary estimates of costs and savings. And our general goal in designing a financing plan for a project is to see the extent to which the energy cost savings can offset the cost of the financing, the PACER funding. Building owners have a number of motivations. Seismic upgrades may be critical. There may be replacement needs for aged equipment, as well as the energy cost savings that come from the efficiency and renewable energy measures. And a financing package can consist of several different sources of funds. The PACER proceeds would be the debt component, but a building owner might contribute a down payment, some of their own capital contribution. Absolutely take a look at utility incentives and maximize those. PSE, for example, Snowbud, Seattle City Light, they all have different incentives for energy efficiency measures. And then also take a look at other incentives that may be offered by the state. And right now there's early adopter incentives available. So the folks that move early are going to get the benefit of those. And that's an incentive the state has designed to promote people to meet the HB 1257 commitments. I want to note too that a lot of contractors involved in this business and offer turnkey engineering with savings verification and guarantees. Washington State has been a leader in public sector energy efficiency for a number of years. We've had an energy savings performance contracting program. There's qualified contractors that the State Department of Environment or Enterprise Services qualifies, offering a pathway for building owners in the public sector to proceed with energy efficiency measures on a negotiated basis with qualified contractors. So we really have a great industry here in Washington State along these lines. Last slide then. I want to add one more point about the tenor as we go to the last slide. Banu, thank you. On the tenor, the term of the financing, we do need to take a look at the useful life of the measures and make sure that overall on a blended or weighted average basis, the useful life matches the term of the financing. So, from the building owner point of view, your project development steps begin with the energy audit. And once you've identified the measures, you can make application to the county. King County, for example, in their guidebook, and I believe this will be common practice, has the building owner together with the capital provider make the application. So the work that the building owner would do to identify a capital provider and make arrangements need to be done as a condition to application to your county. The closing document has a financing agreement with the capital provider. You'd recognize that as a typical loan agreement, but then it has all the attendant lien and assignments associated with the PACER transaction. And then, of course, all the agreements direct between the building owner and your contractor for turnkey works and services. And that contractor can also provide certifications on eligibility. Construction financing can also be arranged. That can be built into the terms of the agreement, the financing agreement with the capital provider. And eligible costs include all of the costs associated with getting the transaction rolling. So I'll stop there, say thank you once again, look forward to your questions in our discussion, and turn it back to you, Banu and Rich.
Thanks, John.
And before we move on, there was one question that did come up, John, that I'll just direct your way prior to moving on here. And that was an understanding from one of the participants that small residential projects are not eligible, but are small mixed use projects eligible? That is, projects that have a ground floor commercial with maybe 2 or 3 residential units above. Those are very common historic property types from a historic standpoint, historic property types in Washington. So would something that's a mixed use project like that be eligible?
I believe the answer is yes. Rich, perhaps you know, and while we're proceeding here, I'm going to confer with the King County Guidebook and just double check on that. But it's a great question. I think it reflects the intent.
Yeah, good question. I think out of the gates here, there's going to be some questions like that will come up that have been unresolved at this point. I know that the structure of the ordinance calls for 4 units.
Yeah, 5 or more dwelling units. I think that's.
Is that better? Okay.
I'm checking the King County Guidebook. It's 5 or more dwelling units.
Thanks, John.
So. Over to you, Banu.
Yep.
Yeah.
Yeah, now I would like to introduce some case studies that used CPACE financing to implement energy efficiency, renewable energy, and resiliency solutions. So the first one is located in Texas. They took out of CPACE loan, which is $1.3 million to fund all of the HVAC and lighting improvements over 20-year term. And the improvements resulted in 38% reduction in energy usage, and then they realized $3.66 million in savings over the term. So here's our second case study, originally built in the 1960s as the headquarters of Hartford National Bank. The 26-story building was renovated as a certified LEED Platinum building with 285 mixed income apartments and commercial space on the ground floor. So here the building was an iconic but dated and inefficient fixture in downtown Hartford, and the developer wanted to differentiate the property and position both the residential and commercial spaces for lease up with the goal of maintaining the external feel of an old bank building while creating a state-of-the-art, highly efficient interior. So the project included the installation of a microgrid and rooftop solar photovoltaics, along with fuel cell energy storage, HVAC, and lighting upgrades. The resulting upgrades allow the building to island itself, meaning operating independently from the grid in the event of natural disaster. I think this is a great example of a broader trend toward using CPACE financing to improve reliability, resiliency, and performance in the built environment. So the capital provider provided a $1 million capital loan that will be repaid over 20 years via a CPACE finance agreement. And since the project's completion, the building has been operating with significantly reduced energy demands, saving $316,000 in the first year. Here's another example of a way that CPACE has been used to finance some retrofits in a very historic building in Colorado. As you see, it's a very, very old building. It needed some upgrades. And in fact, many of the upgrades might not have been justified without PACE as a financing tool. And because of CPACE, they were able to justify insulation, LED lighting, window glazing to reduce heat gain, rooftop heating cooling unit, and PV solar system. So they took out of CPACE loan to fund all of these improvements over 20-year term and realized that 85% reduction in energy usage. And over the lifetime, they realized $780,000 energy savings and increased the value of building by $600K. And my last case study is located in Wisconsin. The old furniture factory building was torn down and rebuilt as commercial spaces. It turned out an energy efficient multi-tenant Class A office building that mixes classic with modern. And the capital provided a $2.2 million capital loan to fund all the improvements such as PV, solar, geothermal, LED lighting, and windows. And as a result of these energy efficiency measures, so the proposed building performs 28% better than the code baseline building. So, and looking at the timeline of CPACER implementation in our state, here is how we got here. So there was a ton of interest in bringing commercial PACE to Washington since it started being used in other states. The most recent effort to bring it to our state began in 2017. Shift Zero, Washington's Zero Carbon Building Alliance, was instrumental on really bringing this work forward for a large of advocacy effort, including support from a lot of stakeholders, including the Building Owners and Managers Association, the Mechanical Contractors Association of Western Washington, the Solar Installers of Washington, and the Washington State Emergency Management Association, of course, in addition to many Shift Zero members. So Shift Zero CPACER Task Force has since collaborated with local and national experts and legal counsels to develop model county program documents, and they were finally successful in 2020. The state legislation enacted CPACER with HB 2405 actually provided the authority for counties to develop CPACER programs, meaning now it's up to counties. Individual counties must adopt their own legislation, authorizing a CPACER program before lending may begin. And Shift Zero model documents are now available for counties to use in their own legal reviews and approval processes. And I think it's really important to mention here, Shift Zero CPACER Task Force has been engaging in outreach to the counties to encourage them, to approve this program. And of course, as you would imagine, it takes some time considering the pandemic, and they've been putting a lot of effort to impact the county's decision-making and get it to the finish line to enable jurisdictions to approve this important financing tool. So, and looking at the current CPACER status map, as a result of this big effort, Clark, King, Thurston, Snohomish, and Whatcom counties have adopted CPACER ordinances, and they are developing their programs as key action in their climate action plans. PRC is also moving forward on a CPACER ordinance as the sustainability plan has been approved by council. And for other counties such as Skagit and Spokane, continue meet with their internal and external stakeholders to discuss the CPACER implementation. And actually now I would like to pass over to Rich for any additional comments and most up-to-date information on the county's adoption status, as he has been a part of this conversation on behalf of Kitsap Bank since day one. Rich?
Hi, Banu. Thank you for the presentation. I think it's just very exciting right now that we can share with this audience that the adoption of the ordinances in each of the counties has really picked up some momentum starting from November of last year on into the first of this year, with Snohomish being the most recent county to adopt the ordinance. I did see in the question box that there was a question on who was going to oversee the program, and each of the counties will oversee the program. Commerce is not directly overseeing any of the programs. So each county will adopt their ordinance and adopt, for the most part, the guidebooks and the documentation that was recommended, and then add any nuances that may be particular to each of their locales. One of the elements of CPACER required a amendment, and across the country there have not been any foreclosure actions on any of the properties on CPACER. And as you might imagine, through COVID, there could have been maybe a little bit more momentum on that space, but that has not happened. That's not precipitated out of these transactions. And so we wanted to ensure that there was no concern from our treasurers, which had voiced some concern initially. And so we've gone back and presented a technical amendment to the bill, and that has made it through the Senate and through to the consent agenda, and then on to the House and through committee, and then on to the House consent agenda. It's now on the floor waiting approval, and it's been unanimously supported by the treasurers, and we have no opposition to the technical fix. So we expect that to be approved on the floor as early as today. So once that's done, we'll be able to transact. I will share with you, and maybe Banu, you can share a little bit of detail about the transaction that actually the first one that has just closed here in Washington. And it's a building that many of you will be familiar with. It's kind of an iconic building in the Kenmore area. And I don't know if you can bring that up, Banu, and maybe share that, but this is the first transaction, CPACER transaction, that's closed in Washington. And I believe that was shared earlier this morning.
Yeah, I saw the news this morning, so I didn't get a chance to review the news in detail. But as you mentioned, I think from the PACE, the company name's PACE Alliance, so they closed the transaction for the project in Kenmore historical building.
So that particular building, some of you may recognize the building. It's a what I would characterize as one of the iconic buildings in the Kenmore area. It's the lodge at St. Edward's Park in Kenmore. And many of you maybe even have attended conferences at that building. So it's beginning the march for us here in Washington in terms of CPACE transactions. Kitsap has been very involved with the legislative support over the last 3 years to get this work done in alignment with the CPACE Alliance and PACE Nation, both two organizations that have been actively engaged with helping the legislative activities in each of the 28 states so far. And if we could go back to Bono's green map, I guess as of today, we can change Washington to a green state. And now that we actually have a transaction that's closed in Washington. So very exciting for us. We have, as John shared with you earlier, there is a pipeline of not only county support, but regional support with organizations that you would recognize like McKinstry, University Mechanical, McDonnell Miller, organizations that have queued up projects standing by for capital providers to provide financing for retrofit and new greenfield projects.
So,
and yeah, I think we have some questions. So someone is asking, can there be some elaboration on how the tax assessment and lien process enables the capital financing terms? does the financer put a lien on your building? Why exactly does the county need to approve the adoption? Rich, do you want to speak to that?
Well, I'll take a piece of it here. As John had mentioned earlier, you may have a mortgage on the building, and the mortgage holder, let's say the capital provider is a bank, that bank has to give consent for the financing to take a priority position on the property. Now, again, as John mentioned, it's a priority position that follows the ownership of the building. And so in the event the building is sold, much like a LID that John mentioned earlier, it follows the building. And consequently, that's not required to be paid during a sale transaction. So that's the first part of the question in terms of putting the lien on the building. And so that capital provider will continue to collect the payments over the life of that assessment. So the question also was presented, what exactly does the county need to approve the adoption? Well, each building is unique, and the work that's done on each building will have to be approved based on each county's specific guidelines in their ordinance as it was passed. And so there's not much difference, but there are some unique pieces in each county. So I would recommend that you look at each county's guidebook to ensure that you're meeting the requirements of the documents that are presented, the validation of the work that's being presented, and that the capital provider has signed off on that work and the validation of the improvements.
I just add a couple points there, Rich, to the question. In the event of a default, there's no acceleration. What has to happen is any past due assessments have to become current. So when you're a banker and you're looking at credit, you want to understand how you get out of a deal and get made whole in event of a default, and you analyze the credit risk of your payor, which in this case is the building owner. And I've looked at a lot of financial statements for building owners, and if they're limited partnerships, et cetera, they may operate their financials in such a way that the credit may not look as good just from a strict balance sheet standpoint, but the building itself is a jewel. It's viable. It's got a strong value. There's good loan to value. So by having that second way out where the assessment runs with the building, the credit analysis can cue off the value of the building and the building viability in addition to the credit worthiness of a given obligor, and that enhances the credit.
Just one piece about the county adoption, and correct me if I'm wrong, but when the state legislature passes enabling legislation, by definition, that means counties have to, quote unquote, enable it or adopt it at that local level. And I think part of that reason is because the state doesn't necessarily want to mandate how it should be applied or implemented at each county. And as Rich noted, each county may have some different requirements or guidelines about how these things happen. So by definition, the enabling legislation as passed by the legislature requires that local county adoption.
And the counties not only adopt the ordinance, they also approve a guidebook. And there are sample form guidebooks that have been put together by the Shift Zero Coalition. There's also guidebooks published. Banu has some resources at the end of the presentation. King County, for example, readily available online, and you can take a look. And that's a template that other communities, other counties may use as well.
And one more question while we have, while we're talking about county adoption from Randy, says, so Walla Walla County isn't even considered yet. How long does the process take to get a county to adopt the program?
Well, I would reach out to your if this were 90 days ago, I would say reach out to your treasurer and have a conversation with your treasurer to get them on board. But now that we have this technical fix in place, we've taken the treasurers out of the process, and they are delighted to be out of the process. And each of your council members for your counties need to go forward and present an ordinance, adopt an ordinance at the behest of that request. And I think one of the things that you'll see in various counties is that there are staff engaged with this work, right. And maybe behind the scenes, and it's not as visible at this point, but many counties have staff working on sustainability, certainly on planning and development, and are very familiar with the CPACE ordinance. And so it's really just getting it visible and getting it prioritized. And I think you've seen the kind of the I-5 corridor adoption, if you will, if you look at the map that Banu's got presented. And I think there are active conversations that are taking place in counties, peripheral counties on that I-5 corridor today. And we expect to see some of those, precipitate with an ordinance by mid-year. So it's moving very quickly. I expect Pierce, for example, to adopt an ordinance here or present an ordinance for adoption here in March.
And we've typically seen commissioners go through a step process. First, to get introduced, have a working session, information session. Commissioners then would direct staff to develop a guidebook or reach out to peers or come back to with recommendations to the commissioner. So it can be adopted as any ordinance in stages with a full vetting. I'm seeing a question too about the model and the use of the term capital provider. That's with a capital C and capital P. It's actually a term of art within the legislation. So that means the entity that's providing the funding, which can be a bank, such as Kitsap Bank, but it can also be other funds. There's a number of national funds that are organized as well as local capital providers.
Thanks for that, John and Richard. And one more county question from Lori. Is there a big difference between different county programs, different emphasis or maybe funding structure?
So today, John, I haven't seen any nuances that what I would say would make one county look different than the other. I think it's more just on their process, but not in terms of the adoption of the ordinance or the bill as it was intended to be used from a capital provider standpoint.
That's my sense as well, Rich. I'm familiar with Thurston. It's where I live. And with King County, where there's first deals that we're developing, and generally the county ordinances and the guidebooks adopted pursuant thereto follow the parameters of the state legislation. I'm seeing a question here also from Ms. Lori Evans about Lewis County. I know there's a Lewis County Energy Innovation Group. I participated in some of their webinars. I'd be happy to help connect you. Lewis County also has the TransAlta Energy Transition Fund, and it has actually been a leader in many ways in renewables. So I sure expect Lewis County to proceed with this. And although I have not been active directly with the commissioners there, I do know folks involved in this work in Lewis County.
And for Kim's question, what is the best website to direct people for more information? Are their model ordinances publicly available? So on my last slide, so I'm providing links for the websites for some of the counties. And also, I would say Shift Zero's website would be a great starting point for directing people for more information.
I wanted to come back to a question that's been up here for a little bit from Melissa about the no requirements for historic designations. I think that's certainly something that is of interest to all of us in the field of historic preservation. And I think, my understanding of this is that if a building is a designated historic structure, any requirements for how that building must be treated in terms of historic appropriate, implementing projects in a historically appropriate way, not adversely impacting historic features. Those local ordinances are still in place. The CPACER does not supersede or somehow exempt building owners from still following those guidelines around historic designation. So the reality is that, yes, indeed, a historic designation is going to impact how a project will be implemented from the standpoint that it should not, it's got to comply with the local ordinance. It needs to go through those approvals the way any project would. But I think that leads to another question around this is, when you have a historic structure, there are certainly other potential sources of funding out there. Do you know do you have some? It was noted earlier that CPACER can provide some gap financing. Do you have examples of other sources of financing that can be twinned or that can be coupled with CPACER that help to make an overall project work? And Melissa, I see your clarification. No, it does not have to only be for historic buildings. That is historic with like a capital H, right? It can be for just other existing buildings.
Regarding complementary funding sources for a project that can help in the bottom line project economics and impact the cash flow for the building owner, there's grants and incentives that should always be assessed. And most contractors, like the ones Rich mentioned, they will have relationships with your electric utility. They'll be knowledgeable about those. The energy audits they perform will generate the information to determine and estimate the amount of incentive money that can come from the utility. There's also the early adopter incentives that I know contractors like McDonnell Miller are very expert in. And there may be other incentives coming down the pike. There's such a plethora of new clean energy funding support, both federal and state and local. But those are the two that I'm most familiar with presently. There can also be, of course, your own down payment that you put forward. And then another key question, if you have tenants, is the balance of the cost distribution between the building owner and the tenant, and with the tenant paying that portion of the assessment, which could be passed through. So the thought process I've typically seen there with developing financing plans is to, again, try to match the energy cost savings benefits with the payments to the greatest extent possible.
Yeah, thanks, guys, for handling the questions coming in so organically. Banu, if you want to conclude your slides, we have about 10 minutes left. And if you guys are hearing this, feel free to drop your last, miscellaneous questions that you had throughout the program, and we'll close our learning lunch soon. But hand it back to Banu.
Yeah, thanks. I think the timeline slide brings us to the question, right? How can the audience today help adopt and implement in their own jurisdiction? And here are some initial practices recommended for you. I think in terms of assessment, the question of what does your city need in terms of CPACER program, it can be very helpful for you to identify and evaluate property sectors so that you can determine what projects or measures or opportunities are currently eligible and available out there. Also, any policies, requirements like mandatory benchmarking or audit ordinances can support definitely CPACER uptake in the commercial sector. And in terms of next steps, I think it is important to check if PACER is authorized in your jurisdiction or not. If yes, you can check out the ordinance that your county adopted to see how you should organize and administer the program in your city and what capital sources you can use. And if the PACER is not authorized yet, then your support, meaning your voice, would mean a lot to stimulate the conversation with the county and impact their decision making. For example, reaching out to your county executives officer or contacting your county council members. So to see if this program is on their radar can be an important action item to remind them that PACER benefits can make it more attractive for property owners to make clean energy improvements. And with the improvements also comes more local jobs, reduced energy use and carbon emissions, healthier buildings, and increased resiliency to disasters in your community. And all of these, of course, may be also being accepted by their climate action plan. And last but not least, with actively supporting program stakeholder engagement and education, you can help spread the word to provide an important tool for financing clean energy in your area. So, Reach, John, do you have any comments on this topic before we close?
Banu, I would just say that if you have some folks in the audience, Chris, that want to follow up if their county has not got momentum behind this, please reach out to me, and I'd be happy to engage you with the CPACE Alliance and Shift Zero so that we could start to help you and your county move forward with adopting an ordinance. We have a lot of experience with talking with council members and treasurers and staff, and we'd be glad to engage with you to help support that work. We've spent 36 months doing this, meeting with all of those mentioned before, and it's been remarkable how willing they've been to work to adopt those ordinances and to present the material and move it forward. So don't be shy.
Yeah, thanks for the reminder, Rich.
I'm seeing a question here too about stormwater projects, and I've been checking the King County Guidebook handily, and it refers to stormwater management. And my general sense, Rich, you may have a better understanding, is that any improvement has to be on site within the boundary of the given property or the given building. We have a number of historic buildings here in Olympia where I had an office for many years downtown with flat roofs. Why someone would build a flat roof in Olympia, I don't really know, but we had leak problems in that building. So, for example, envelope improvements to build a parapet, improve drainage, et cetera, I'm sure would qualify. But it's a good question, and maybe we can find some further examples to share.
I know there's just with a follow-up question, as people may add some more into the Q&A box here as they come up, but just a direct follow-up. Obviously, our as I noted before, our work is in historic buildings with historic preservation. And I know we still have kind of a small sample size in Washington State with projects that have closed, although it sounds like that first one is a historic project with the Lodge at St. Edwards, and that's obviously a wonderful example. Are you seeing either with those projects in the works here in Washington State or others that have happened across the country, is there a scale or threshold of building size at which this really works, or as long as the guidance and the legislation allows for a building of a certain size to participate, the size and scale really doesn't matter? Is there a balance in those two?
I would say first, it's determining eligibility, as you said, And the next consideration is a commercial capital provider consideration. So, Rich, maybe it has to do with minimum transaction size to warrant the transaction cost and quarter million.
It's a good question, Chris. I think we don't have experience here locally. Nationally, the perspective has been that the very small projects have been more complicated and not impossible to do, but because there's some costs that associate with getting the transaction completed at each of the counties, they have their own costs for the transactions as well as the capital providers. You have to take those things into consideration in the rolling up of those soft costs into the transaction to ensure that it doesn't mute the benefits of the project attributes that are being considered.
There was kind of a follow-up to that just popped up in the Q&A box. Is there a definition of small project? Is there an estimation or approximation of what dollar amount constitutes a small project, or is it not defined that way yet?
We haven't defined it. We've gone through and written our policy, our credit policy, and we have not defined that. And I think, we'll have to look at each project kind of on a case-by-case basis as they present themselves. And then we'll have, I think, maybe a track record where we can start to demonstrate where there is a threshold. But to date, I think we are opening, the doors and the opportunities. The capital providers from outside the state that are unregulated capital providers have looked at projects that a de minimis of $2 million with some and $5 million with others. And so there's some that are at $1 million. So it's kind of a spattering of different levels depending on what their own policies are.
Rich, I take your answer to be an encouragement to explore.
Absolutely.
If you have a building that you want to explore, because I think projects even in the few $100,000 range can probably withstand the transaction cost. And also, as we gain experience here in Washington State, I think we'll have a better handle on and be able to further minimize transaction costs.
Yeah, I would leave this closing comment. I want to be respectful of everyone's time, but we have not put a de minimis on it. We are looking to also take a path forward to try to create a fast lane, if you will, for transactions with each of the counties so that we can expedite those through. And while doing so, also try to reduce the cost of those transactions based on our experience and agreements with each of the counties. So more to follow on that. Thank you, everyone, for your attendance today. I know John, Banu, and myself appreciate all the questions, and we'd be glad to stay in touch. And I think Chris and Wei will circulate our contact emails and information for future use if necessary.
Yeah, definitely. Thank you guys for joining us today. I'll leave their names and their titles before we close out, and I will be sending out the contact information and the links that Banu shared at the end of her slide. But once again, we thank you guys so much for joining us. For more programs like this and other kinds of workshops, please don't hesitate to reach out. And with that, I'll close out. Thank you, everyone, for joining us today. Hope you have a good rest of your day.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you all.
Thank you.